So the world has been watching in horror the events of the last week or so. First, it started with the Hamas attacks on Israel, innocent Israeli civilians, and now there is a massive retaliation operation by Israel. But where does the story go beyond the next 6 months? Yes, Israel is preparing for a ground offensive, but what about beyond that? What comes in place of Hamas if indeed the objective of this is to obliterate Hamas and ensure the end of Hamas? Joining me now is Mr. Ian Bremmer. He's the head of the Eurasia Policy Group. Thank you very much, Mr. Bremmer, for joining us. First things first, and I think our viewers need to sort of make sense of this. Why would Hamas do such a thing as they did on Saturday, where they went after elderly women, they went after babies, they went after young people who were at an outdoor music festival? What was the immediate provocation? Because I don't see anything come out of that attack and the series of attacks that we saw over the past weekend other than Israel's response to it, which, as they claim, their military objective is to annihilate Hamas. So why would they do it?
Look, I'm not in a position where I can help you understand what goes on in the minds of a terrorist attack. I mean, that's like asking me, why would Osama bin Laden orchestrate the killing of thousands of Americans in the Pentagon and the Twin Towers? I mean, this is a sick and depraved act. It's an inhuman act. But what I can tell you is that the Palestinian situation was becoming marginalized and desperate over the course of the past 10 years. And this is true in the region. There were lots of people around the world that said that you could not actually resolve anything in the Middle East without peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. That turned out not to be true. You had Israel with normalization of relations with Bahrain, with the UAE, and with Morocco. Even as the Palestinian situation got worse, you had improved relations with Saudi Arabia, even as the Palestinian situation got worse. Inside Israel, you had enormous focus on judicial reform and demonstrations, domestic demonstrations, Netanyahu's corruption cases, all of this distraction, nobody talking about the plight of the Palestinians. In fact, the Israelis only taking more illegal land, settlements on the ground in the West Bank. So the Israelis weren't paying attention to it either. And meanwhile, particularly in Gaza, you had 2.3 million Palestinians that were living like animals, 90% without access to clean water, 50% living in hunger, no way to educate themselves and their children, no way to have proper employment and economic opportunities. None of this justifies terrorist activity, but all of this helps to explain that the situation for the Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, was getting worse and worse and worse, and no one cared. No one was prepared to do anything about it. So, I mean, that's the context for what we have seen over the course of the past days.
But there is now a sort of seeming distinction, if you will, between, yes, the root cause, the Palestinian question, the two-state solution, the peaceful coexistence of Israel and Palestine on the one side. That is a long-standing thing. That's been happening for the last 50-plus years now. But the events of Saturday and the consequences of the events of Saturday, that is being framed in a very different narrative, and that is pure terror. It is terror that is driven by a certain violent ideology, which is not just about the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. This is perhaps about attacking people for who they are and what religion they follow and what faith they follow. I think those two distinctions, how do you separate the argument?
I mean, I hate to say it, Gaurav, but I think you're focusing on the wrong issue. I mean, Hamas has been killing civilians indiscriminately for a long time, but they haven't killed very many. And the reason for that is because they haven't had the capacity to do so. So what's really changed in the last several months has been Netanyahu's failure to protect Israeli civilians. That is what has changed. I mean, for the last 6 months, I've spoken publicly about Israel a great deal. No one's asked me about the Palestinians. Netanyahu, as prime minister, has access to the best border security in the world, the best human intelligence in the world, the best signals intelligence in the world. And for the last 6 months, he has ignored that. He has taken troops from the Israeli Defense Forces away from Gaza and moved them into the West Bank to deal with expanded settlements and Palestinian reprisals. His own cabinet has said, we're not worried about Hamas. They're not planning any significant attacks in Israel. This was an unprecedented intelligence failure. I mean, the issue is not that Hamas has suddenly changed. The issue is that Netanyahu has failed to protect Israeli civilians. And by the way, the Israeli people overwhelmingly blame Netanyahu for that. The Jerusalem Post, which is not a left-wing newspaper in Israel by any stretch, it's on the right, just did a survey, and 86% of Israelis blame Netanyahu for the failures here. So, I mean, this is truly landing on his desk. He is accountable for security for the Israeli civilians, and he failed them.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with you 100% there. I don't see a way in which Netanyahu survives this war, maybe 3 or 6 months from now. No doubt about it, there was a colossal intelligence failure, and you're right when you argue that the events of the last 7-8 months, the crisis with the judiciary, the armed forces, that sort of, took the foot away from the pedal. But when you said that Hamas has now acquired that capability, now what I'm curious to know is, and a lot of people are alluding to this, is that capability was perhaps enabled by the Iranians. If indeed that is true, and so far we have no evidence of it. Neither Americans are saying that, nor are the Israelis. But if at some point in the near future they find evidence of an Iranian involvement in this, what may that mean? What are the chances of this now spreading into a wider regional conflict?
I think it's very low that this is going to spread into a war with Iran. The Iranians don't want that. The Americans don't want it. And frankly, the Israelis don't want it either. The Iranians immediately came out and, of course, called for the destruction of the Zionist regime. That's a criminal act, and it's disgusting. But they also claimed zero responsibility, and they had their first discussion with Mohammed bin Salman publicly, the Iranian president, and said they want an end to the fighting. So, look, I don't think there's a big difference between orchestrating the attack and complicity. There is alignment. The Iranians have provided military support for Hamas. We know that. But there is no evidence that the Iranians were involved in orchestrating it. In fact, there is evidence that the Iranians were surprised by the attacks when they occurred. So, I mean, we can talk about hypotheticals. If it turns out that evidence is wrong and the Iranians were really behind it, then I have no doubt that there'll be strikes against Iran. But we are not there. We're not close to there. We're not heading in that direction. If there is an expansion of the war, the likely expansion will be first and foremost into the West Bank, where you have lots of Palestinians that will feel a level of solidarity with their co-nationals in Gaza, and who are now fleeing their homes, over 400,000 in the last 72 hours. Many of them are getting killed, larger numbers of Palestinian deaths than Israeli deaths since the Hamas attacks just a few days ago. And as those numbers get higher, the potential that Palestinians will engage in violent reprisals in the West Bank against Israeli settlers and over the border is going up. So certainly that's possible. Hezbollah is possible over time, and that kind of escalation could lead to an expansion of the war. But we are very, very far from Iran becoming a direct belligerent here.
I also want to know your thoughts on what we are seeing as a reaction to this war in Western capitals, whether it's Paris, London, I believe New York City is on high alert. We're seeing this in campuses across the United States, where there are deep divisions between those who support Israel and those who support the Palestinian cause. It's got to a point where we are now seeing openly anti-Semitic slogans, pushing and shoving. Thank God it hasn't got to a violent phase yet. But what does that indicate to you?
Well, we need to recognize that the United States has enormous bipartisan support for Israel. And that is not just about political elites in Washington. That is about the population at large. There is a fringe in progressive urban centers, particularly campuses that support the Palestinians. And there's an even tinier fringe that would use Nazi iconography to express that support. The problem is that we have social media algorithms driven primarily by Twitter, X, and Elon Musk individually that are actively promoting the worst possible hatred and the extremes and making it seem as if these are much more popular than they actually are. Remember, after 9/11 in the United States, the overwhelming challenge in terms of civil society was a willingness to treat all Muslims as potential belligerents. The Patriot Act, racial, religious profiling, massive anti-Muslim sentiment in the United States. You do not have average American citizens in this environment saying, oh, yes, we're with the Palestinians. And the only reason you're even asking me that question is because algorithmically, that tiny minority has been promoted through social media. Social media today is the single biggest challenge to an effective functioning democracy in the US and around the world. It is completely unregulated. And that is a very big challenge going forward.
So let me ask you a final question on exactly that. And I think this whole social media and what it can do, the good and the bad, was exemplified by this whole story about Hamas terrorists capturing and beheading babies. Israel, of course, some would say if you are in their position, you would make a huge noise about it. The IDF spoke about it. Netanyahu tweeted pictures about it. Even Mr. Biden spoke about it, only for the White House to then walk back on that. Do you see this war of propaganda and a war of narratives going forward? Because let's face it, I mean, Israel is going to go in and there's going to be tens of thousands of civilian deaths as well, and some of them will be young children. Are you seeing this sort of fight for narrative, the moral high ground, if you will? And how do you discount the fact that when most Israelis turn around and say, but look, what started it, all of this, was what happened on Saturday?
I've never gotten the kind of death threats from both pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian sources as I have in the last 48, 72 hours. I've never seen the kind of disinformation and hatred promoted as I have in that environment. It's not because the people have changed. You would never experience that in your community, in your school, in your family. You never would. You are experiencing it algorithmically because it is the business model. You get more clicks and more eyeballs by treating human beings as products. You get more eyeballs by driving hate. We would never experiment real time on people like this with vaccines or GMO food. We would never do it. We would always test it first to see if it was safe. We are testing right now on human beings, these algorithms, and seeing what's going to happen. They are treated as the product, and that is causing much greater tribalism and hatred and dehumanization. So again, I want to be clear. What's different in this war is not the atrocities. We've seen atrocities before, Darfur, right? We've seen atrocities, Rwanda. We've seen atrocities, Haiti, Chechnya, Ukraine. What's different in this war is the level of algorithmic disinformation, which is actively promoted to make people dehumanize other humans. And that is functionally very, very dangerous for the 8 billion of us that need to live together on this little planet.
All right. Ian Bremmer, thank you very much for speaking with us here on CNN News 18. Thank you for your time.
Good to see you. Thank you.